pleasure to be welcoming you on my insightful leadership conversation series. As I said, it's a dream come true. Ever since I met you at NLI in 2018, it's been on my mind that I need to host you on my guest whenever I began this show. So thank you for consenting. And you are doing such a yeoman service by researching in the neuroscience space that is so important in the leadership world today. And that sets the context beautifully for my first question to you, which is, it's been $1 billion question. Are leaders born or are they made? Nature versus nurture. And what is neuroscience take on it?
Yeah, well, before I answer that, just thank you so much for hosting me and thank you for all of the kind words. I am humbled and happy to be with you. And I might even argue it's $1 trillion question, right? If we could answer that. And so, the challenge is there are clearly differing perspectives, differing kind of research. And I think the answer is still out. We know that there's a part of nature that absolutely plays a role. We know there's a part of nurture that plays a role. I will say the things that we do at the Neuro Leadership Institute and the things that I take a lot of kind of pride in is this idea that it's not all or the other, right? Mm-hmm. That we talk quite a bit about growth mindset, which is obviously work that was done by Dr. Carol Dweck out of Stanford University. And this idea that we can continue to grow and develop and push ourselves and challenge ourselves. And that in fact, that growth and development is an integral part of the work that we do. And so when we think about leaders, I would also argue, and we've spoken a little bit with Dominic Packer out of Lehigh University, this idea that leadership is not even necessarily completely consistent, but that it's contextual, right? That different times and different teams call for different types of leadership. And so I think in a lot of ways, it's partially about understanding what do we believe leadership means? I mean, that's another $1 billion or $1 trillion question is it only certain people in an organization or in a community or in a civilization? Is everyone a leader in some aspect of their lives, whether that's as a parent or as a sibling or as a community member? And so what the neuroscience tells us is that we can continue to grow, we can continue to develop. Many listeners will have heard of the idea of neuroplasticity, right? That our brains are not fixed and that we continue to kind of rewire and rejigger and change things around. And yet there are definitely, we see in many instances, folks that have a natural predisposition for what we've defined as leadership. And I think that's the other thing that we need to pull apart. And this is very much a kind of sociological question, is what do we believe leadership is? Is it being loud and outgoing? Is it being attractive? Is it any of these things that are maybe not as relevant? Or is it the ability to move other people? And I think if it's the ability to move other people and to get them to want to follow you, then as I said, there are some folks that we see that are born with a little bit of that, but we absolutely can build it. And that I think is something we can all take a lot of real pride and solace in.
Beautiful. So I hear you say neuroplasticity, which is so relevant to the world, to the learning world of today. And I also hear you say contextual in terms of leadership, and both of those are brilliant insights. So I know there's a lot of work that Neuro Leadership Institute has done in the space of SCARF, the model that you've created that resonates and resounds so much globally. So would you like to share more insights on it?
I would love to talk about SCARF. SCARF is definitely one of those models that is foundational to so much of what we do. And so for anyone that doesn't know, SCARF is an acronym. It stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And so I can pull those apart a little bit, but the essence of where those come from is to understand that humans are wired to largely avoid threat and to seek out reward. And we tend to think about that in a physical manifestation. So we want to avoid the tiger or the lion. We want to go after the fruit or the partner. But ironically enough, so much of the threat that we experience in our worlds is social threat. It is, am I going to be a part of this in group or am I a part of the out group? And that has very evolutionary kind of mechanisms, because back in the day, we're not huge as it relates to most other mammals, right? We don't have sharp teeth or big claws. We're not all that scary on our own. And so social networks evolved to help us take care of one another, support one another, protect one another, care for one another. And so we care very deeply around, am I in your in group? Do you like me? Are you bringing me in? Am I one of the team? And SCARF is a way to really pull that apart, because when we think about inclusion or we think about threat and reward, sometimes we think about them in such broad terms that it can be really difficult to understand, what am I meant to do with that? So when one of my employees says to me, I don't feel included, our natural tendency is to start copying them on more emails or inviting them to more meetings. But if they mean, I don't feel like my status is being supported, or I'm getting status rewards in terms of how do I fall in the hierarchy of the organization. Certainty is about, do I have the information that I need? Am I in the communication loop? Autonomy is, do I have some control or some agency over the way that things are done in my world? Relatedness is, am I a part of that in-group? And so again, we tend to think of inclusion only as belonging, but that's a part of a larger model. And then fairness, do I believe that I get the same rewards and recognition that others do for putting in similar amounts of effort and energy? And so that was developed probably 5 or 6 years ago by our CEO, Dr. David Rock, and a number of other incredible social psychologists and neuroscientists. And we've seen it just continue to be really beneficial year over year and in lots of different contexts and experiences. And it's even risen a bit more, I would say, to prominence in this time of COVID-19, where folks are trying to figure out, I'm going through a lot of threat. Where is this coming from? And what are some things that I can do to almost buffer myself against the fact that I recognize I'm going to have some of this threat? So how can I get out in front of it, or how can I recognize it and mitigate it?
Lovely, lovely. So there I hear you say a lot about care. There I hear you say a lot about security, status, certainty, autonomy, and all of it makes for a beautiful world if we truly understand and we are able to kind of work on those 5 aspects of the SCARF model. The biggest challenge, I think, as humans we face is the fact that change is very hard.
Yes.
Right from a small habit of waking up early to a very huge shift in a leadership mindset. It's so challenging. So what has been your experience as to why change is so hard, especially when we are coaching leaders, especially when leadership mindset changes have to happen? What are your thoughts on that, Khalil?
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, change is hard, in part because we are wired to look for predictability and habits, right? And kind of consistency. The other part of why it's so hard is that I would argue, and lots of others would as well, that change and the rate of change is accelerating. And so if we've evolved in kind of our, ancestors and predecessors, the change was more about the seasons or about decades or about periods of life. Now we're dealing with technological changes and political changes and organizational changes and all of these things that are being thrust upon us, largely outside of our control. And it just feels like there's never a moment where you can just set your feet and know that things are going to be okay for a little while. And so that idea of predictability is fleeting. Right? Whereas before we said, these are the things I really want. So our brains are looking for habits because we've evolved to, and I mean this in the best way possible, be kind of lazy. right? We don't want to have to think very deeply about these things. Our brains want to conserve energy, they want to conserve resources. And so the more we can turn things into habits and make them predictable, the less resources are taken up. So you've heard of something, or might have heard of something called decision fatigue, right? Just this idea that we have a limited amount of cognitive capacity over the course of a day. And so the more we can make certain things routine, the more energy we conserve for those really important decisions. And that's why, as we grow up, we learn, I'll just make brushing my teeth a habit, right? Most of us don't get up and try to decide, am I going to brush my teeth or not? Or am I going to put on clothes or not, right? We turn those things into habits so that we can just move on from them and get on to the next thing. But the more we try and change some of those things, our brains are saying, wait, this is easy. This is simple. I like this. I like the fact that this is a bit more predictable and I don't have to make those decisions. I don't have to integrate in all that additional work. And so in a lot of ways, part of what's even more productive than trying to erase an old habit is to try to build a new habit on top of it. And so instead of trying to stop smoking, start chewing gum. Or instead of, trying to stop watching TV, start getting up and moving around. And so if you can replace something as opposed to trying to erase something, we find that that's much more productive.
Lovely. So it's more of a future forward kind of a mental mindset that leaders or people need to develop for change to set in. And you answered a part of my question, which was around why is decision making so hard? So part of the answer perhaps is that it takes a lot of energy to actually decide. And so the brain probably conserves all of it to be using it when it's most required. So,
absolutely.
Okay. So, coming back to, today we are living in an attention era. There's so much information that is available. We go after all sorts of information, and at the end of the day, wonder which are the three pieces that mean most to me, by which time we've forgotten the information that we've collated, right? So what are your inputs for people or leaders to practice which can help them focus in an attention era?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple different things. I'll tell you, part of what I have done, and actually interestingly enough that you use this term focus, because part of what we built at the Neuro Leadership Institute is a product called Focus, to help people figure out how to adapt and in some ways even thrive through crisis. Because we recognize that right now, and this was really predicated on COVID-19 and everything that was coming up, that people were saying, I can't concentrate, there's a lot going on, I don't know what to do, this is really challenging for me. And so the three habits that we talked about, and I'll kind of break those down a little bit. One was to take care of yourself, one was to look after each other, and one is to deliver what matters. And so when we think about taking care of ourselves, there are things we can do. The research is pretty overwhelming that mindfulness is really beneficial. Things like turning off some of your social media feeds and not going out and getting as much news, because we think that an abundance of information is going to be useful. And yet in reality, we reach a point of saturation pretty quickly where we're not actually taking in new information. We're either just reinforcing our existing beliefs, or we're going out and seeking out kind of confirming information, or we're railing against the other side almost, if you will. So as we think about taking care of ourselves, am I getting enough rest? Am I getting enough hydration? We spoke about SCARF before. So we've been talking about this idea of SCARF buffers, which are, if I know that later in the week I'm going to have some degree of threat that is introduced, whether that's because of work or because of the news or because of home, what are some things that I can do towards the beginning of the week to lift myself up in one of those or more of those domains, right? So those are ways that we can be taking care of ourselves. When we think about looking after one another, it's very similar, right? How are we reaching out? How are we doing kind things for one another? How are we supporting each other? And then in terms of deliver what matters, there are only a handful of things that we can really focus our attention on. And so we tend to think we're really good at multitasking. Turns out the research shows overwhelmingly we're actually doing what's called task switching, right? So we're going back and forth between tasks, and we're losing about 40% of our productivity every time we go back and forth between those tasks. So if we can think about those three habits, really taking care of ourselves, looking after each other, and delivering what matters, it allows us to focus in and to kind of get rid of some of the additional work or the excess or the noise. And we know largely that those things are there, and yet we choose not to do them. And so that comes into this knowing doing gap, where we know it's better to shut down Facebook for a while or shut down Twitter for a while, but I'm just going to scroll for a little bit longer. And then before you know it, it's been 30 minutes or an hour. Or we know that we should reach out to that person that we haven't spoken with in a while, but you know what? I'll do it tomorrow. These are some of the things that if we lean more into those things that we already kind of intuitively know, we really can protect ourselves and be very deliberate about where we focus our energy and where we focus our effort.
Beautiful. So you led us through a journey of SCARF. You led us through a journey of, conserving energy for decisions. Now you're talking about 3 things that one can do to focus. And given the fact that, like you rightly said, the world is shifting, we are seeing so many inflections hitting us day in and day out. Learning is something that is becoming the need of the hour. And it's no longer a want, rather, it is a need for every individual in an organization or otherwise. Metacognition, which is learning how to learn, is even more important from whatever I'm seeing learning evolve over the years, or the way learning has evolved over the years. How do you think the brain plays a role in metacognition? How does the brain really help us learn how to learn?
Well, in part, it's when we know more about ourselves and we know more about the way that our brains take in information, then we can pay attention to that. And I dare say even start to kind of manipulate it. And I mean, manipulate in a good way. Right? So there's a model that we've used that was developed with Professor Leila Davachi out of New York University that is all about the science of learning. So there are a couple things that come up. One, we tend to think of, and learning is different than memories, and so we can separate those things out. But we tend to think of these things almost in a condition where if you've learned something once, you know it, and you're going to continue to know it forever. Whereas in reality, we know that's not the case, right? Memories are similar in some ways, where we think that we kind of have them and we can access them almost like a file cabinet. But in reality, it's almost more like a garden, that the ones that you water start to sprout and grow. The ones that you don't pay attention to atrophy and kind of fade away. But the work that we did with Professor Davachi was to understand kind of the 4 elements of learning. And those 4 elements make up another acronym, because we love our acronyms, but it is AGES, AGES, and it is attention, generation, emotion, and spacing. And so attention is about how do we kind of focus our energy and our attention on whatever it is that we're supposed to be learning. Generation is how do we actually activate, right? How do we almost metaphorically roll up our sleeves and get into something? Because we've all probably sat through a presentation where we weren't really paying attention. We heard the same thing other people heard, and yet because we weren't making active connections to it or doing anything with it, we probably let it go just as quickly as we heard it. Right? Emotion is about how do we create just a little bit of what we'd call a toward state. So we are actually activating a bit of emotion as it relates to that learning. And then spacing. That's the one that I think in so many school systems and so many universities and so many businesses we get wrong, because we try and give everyone all of the information all at once and then assume that now that they've heard it, they'll be able to go off and do that thing. But in reality, again, the research shows overwhelmingly that if we space out that learning and give people multiple instances to come back to something, they retain it more and they're more able to do something with it. And so if we think about that, this idea of metacognition, right, learning how to learn, learning the best ways that we learn, thinking about our own learning, when we recognize that there are some pretty formulaic things that we can follow that make learning more sticky, make it more memorable, make it more active, and increase the likelihood that we're going to do something with it, then that has tremendous benefits. And even just to go back to something we talked about at the beginning, this idea of mindset, right? If I am apprehensive about the learning, or I wish I didn't need to learn this thing, or I just like the way that it was done before, that can be construed as a fixed mindset. And I'm less likely, of course, to actually lean in and learn something, versus approaching it with a growth mindset, which is to say, okay, this may not be what I did before, and maybe I was successful at what I did before, but what can I learn? How can I develop? How can I do things differently as I move forward? And we're much more open and receptive to that learning, and therefore much more likely to actually take it on.
Beautiful. So I hear you say that, you spoke about the AGES model, which is the best acronym that I can think of for learning. So thank you for that. And this also kind of pushes me back in terms of thinking that, very often I think we need to hit the pause button to be able to sit down and think about how we learn. Because we are racing against time, and sometimes we are doing so many things much before we understand the right way to do it. So one of the biggest takeaway for me is to kind of hit the pause button, think about spacing your learning, the way you're architecting your own brain, and imagining neuroplasticity happening with a growth mindset, and then take on learning. Beautiful.
Yeah, and I mean, it's challenging because, to your point, because things are changing so quickly, because there's so much happening, we want to keep up, right? And especially as we think about being business leaders and, the fact that our markets are changing, there is this imperative to always drive forward as quickly as possible. And yet part of what we see is that for folks that are able to slow down, kind of survey the land a little bit, do what they feel like is really right, and then evaluate that and kind of continue to evolve. I have found those to be some of the people that are the most successful, because my father has always said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there, right? And when you're just running and going, and we see that, I'm sure all of us have had those weeks where it feels like we're just living day to day, we're just getting things done, we've lost sight of the bigger picture, we're not clear on what it is we're trying to accomplish, and those never feel like our most productive weeks or months or years. Versus pausing to say, where am I going? What am I trying to accomplish? How does all of this fit together? How do I prepare myself to deliver on this thing? And that doesn't mean that we're paralyzed by inaction. It just means that we're taking just another moment to do exactly what you're describing, which is to say, how can I be most effective as I move forward? How do I not confuse motion with progress? Because motion is just doing things. Progress is actually doing things that get us closer to our desired outcome. And we need to be focused on progress, because that's how we know that we're actually producing something and adding value both for ourselves and for others.
Beautiful. I think the motion versus progress is again a brilliant piece. And I love your analogy of the garden. What you water flowers most. So thanks for both of that. On a completely different perspective on a learner, this relates to probably the SCARF model where you spoke about autonomy. I think, in today's world, there is a lot of push that, chief learning officers have to do very often to get the whole workforce to shift to learning, right? And how does autonomy or a sense of control that you can give the learner in terms of the choice that he or she can make in the learning process, in the way he learns, shift the culture of learning? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, introducing a degree of autonomy, and you're absolutely right. There's kind of this balance that I find a lot when I'm working with clients or kind of having conversations between and amongst certainty and autonomy. Because we want to provide a degree of certainty so that people know and can kind of predict a bit of their future. And yet we also recognize and know that autonomy is really important in terms of getting people to want to buy in and getting them to want to persevere. And so sometimes when we think of autonomy, and I tend to talk about these almost as if they're dials, right? They're not light switches that you turn on or off where you either have autonomy or you don't, or you either have certainty or you don't. You can almost turn them from 1 to 10 or probably even 1 to 100. And so if you're dialing up some of the certainty, you may be dialing down a bit of the autonomy or vice versa. And as we think about learning, there's probably an opportunity for those things to meet a little bit in the middle or to provide both of them. And so some of the certainty may be, listen, we're clear that there's a learning journey, and yet the sequence during which you take those things is completely up to you. Or how long it takes you to do those things may be a bit up to you. Or do you want to do them as a part of a social network where you're going to connect with other people? Or would you prefer to do that a bit more individualistically? That can be up to you. And so even just being clear and transparent about some of the autonomous decisions that are available will help people recognize, oh, I do have choice here and here and here. Because a lack of autonomy feels threatening. For anybody that's ever worked with a micromanager where it felt like every single thing that you do is being laid out for you, it's not a fun place to be. Even if you're newer in your career or newer to a particular role, you want some degree of trust. You want some degree of agency. And so as we think about chief learning officers and learning and development teams, it's a matter of how do we not just say, here's what people need to know, therefore they need to know it exactly the way that we want them to know it, but to marry this idea of ages with this idea of autonomy and SCARF as a whole, and say, how do we provide some of those options so that we know we're getting to the end result? Everyone is going to learn this thing. Everyone is going to be able to demonstrate this new behavior or complete this new task. And yet how they get there has enough flexibility that we can really meet people where they are. And I think that largely goes to what I talk with a lot of clients about, where they want to understand what should be managed globally and what are some of the things that need to be managed locally. So we have an office in Singapore and Mumbai and here and here and here. What are the things that we control and we say this is the way you must do it? And what are some of the things that need to be really locally relevant? And this can be a useful model for separating those two things out and being very deliberate about both.
Beautiful. So it's more like providing flexibility with a framework that will
absolutely
work. So
yes.
It's simply with autonomy that will probably propel learning in the right way in organizations.
Absolutely.
Our brain is so powerful, and I've heard you say this so many times in several different places. And always, when we sit back and reflect, it's not that we've capitalized the power of our brain as much as we ideally should have. So do you have any tips on how one can actually capitalize on the power of the brain?
Yeah, I will say, and I think it's worth noting because some of the things that are said sometimes in the popular press is that, we only use 10% of our brain or we only use kind of our left and our right. I am not a scientist by trade. I am a leader by trade, but all of the scientists I work with would absolutely give me all sorts of drama if I did not correct some of that. So our brains are constantly firing. There's all sorts of stuff going on. We're using different parts, and there's still a lot that our neuroscientists don't know about the brain. And yet, to your point, there's a lot that we don't recognize. And I think one of the most important things that we can do, and if I could advocate almost for anything in terms of kind of early childhood education or kind of prep school or university, is for more of us to understand psychology, for more of us to understand kind of behavioral economics, because the more we understand about ourselves and about others, the less we are captive to the way that our brains automatically react. And so when we think about bias, when we think about categorization, when we think about kind of the quick decisions that we make or the way that we filter information, the way that we view the world, our brains are manipulating all of that. And manipulate is probably the right word, right? Like our brains color our perspective and lead us to believe that we are right more often than we are, or that we are, should be confident about things that maybe we shouldn't be confident about. And as we start to learn some of these biases, I find that there's a lot of power in saying, now I understand where that decision is coming from. Now I don't need to be subject just to my whims or my follies, but I really can understand why I seek out certain newspapers more than others, or why I connect with certain of my direct reports more than others. And so if we just lean into, well, it feels right, therefore this is what I'm going to do, then we're not really taking advantage of the opportunity and all of the science and all of the information that could lead us to a place of more insight and a place of better reflection. But the more we know about ourselves, the more we know about our brains, the better we're able to respond to the world around us, and the better we are in terms of being partners and coworkers and leaders and citizens of the world. And so there's lots and lots of information out there. Some of it is very digestible and very easy to read. And maybe it's just me, but I actually find it quite fun to read through some of those things and see some of those biases or see some of those mental shortcuts that I've made over time. And then to think about, how will I do things differently, and how do I continue to lift that veil that my brain is constantly kind of putting over my eyes to say, you don't quite see it right, Khalil, and you're not always accurate, and you're not the smartest person in the room, and here's why. And that is, to me, really empowering. And I've found lots and lots of people all across the world that have said the more we learn about ourselves, the better off we are. And it's almost like, you can get into a car and just drive it. I am not a car person myself. I like them, but I don't understand a lot of what's going on under the hood. But I've got friends that really understand what's happening with the vehicle, that when something starts to go wrong, they say, oh, that's probably this, or, oh, I think that might be that. And I would equate it very similar to us. There are some of us that are just kind of driving around in the bodies that we have and not paying attention really to any of what's going on really cognitively. And then there are others that are saying, I want to better understand so that when I'm having a reaction or when I'm feeling a certain way, I can pull that apart and better kind of put some language to what I'm experiencing. And I think that's a really valuable and really unique moment in history, where right now we have access to so much information that can really make us much more competent about what's going on.
Beautiful. So you're actually saying that one should focus a lot on what is happening around us, within us, maybe tie in mindfulness completely and make that a way of life for capitalizing our brain at the end of the day, which is
absolutely. And there's, for some, there will be a very spiritual element to that, which is, how do I kind of understand myself and center myself and come back together? For others, there's a very academic point of view on that, which is just, I want to understand what's going on in my head so that I can kind of change it and adapt and understand. And I think those two things overlap quite a bit, because it is truly just to say, I don't just want to operate in the world and kind of, leave a wake of things kind of behind me without understanding why I react in certain ways, and why do I think certain things, and why do I approach problems in a certain way. And so that goes right back to what you were talking about in terms of, how do I learn best and why? How do I react to certain things and why? Why do I connect with certain employees or direct reports or bosses and why? So there's a lot that can be kind of taught there, either from a spiritual side, a religious side, a kind of an academic side, a scientific side, or best of all of them.
beautiful. What I wanted to ask you was, I heard you speak about allyship in a couple of talk shows, if I remember right. Could you just explain more about what does NLI believe as allyship? How do you define it, and why is it so important to the corporate world?
Yeah, and our point of view is continuing to evolve. I mean, I think that's one of the things I love about Neuro Leadership Institute the most, is that we never feel like we've 100% got it right. So we'll try some things, we'll go to the science, we'll see what really works, and then we'll put it out into the world and say, does this seem accurate? But we also like to kind of challenge the conventional wisdom versus the research and say, well, this is what we might have been doing before. This is what the research actually tells us to do now. So our current point of view on allyship is that it really is kind of comprised of two components. The first is an awareness that certain parts of our demographic, certain identities, hold more power in certain scenarios than others. And so in certain cultures, being male is preferential to being female, or being Caucasian is preferential to being African American, or being tall is preferential to being short, right? Those are things that hold certain power in certain areas. The second part of allyship is what you do with that knowledge. And so how do you help to tear down or rebuild certain systems that aren't creating equitable outcomes for people because of those identities. And so allyship is very big right now as we work in kind of North America, or specifically in the United States, because of, many listeners would have heard of the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality. And so there are lots and lots of white coworkers that are saying, oh my gosh, this has now been raised to my awareness. Or even if we go back a little bit with the Me Too movement, I think there are a lot of similarities there, where all of a sudden a lot of men said, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that things were this challenging. What can I do? I don't suffer from those same challenges, and I recognize that others do, and I want to use my position of authority or advantage or privilege to build a better system so that everyone benefits from that thing. And that's why it's so important in corporate America right now, is that what we're recognizing increasingly is that for a long time, certain groups have known that things weren't completely fair, right? But that was isolated to some of those groups. And as loud as they yelled, other people on the outside maybe didn't hear. So for many of the women I knew when the Me Too movement happened, they said, this isn't new. Right? We've had these conversations around what do you do and who don't you go out to dinner with and how do you navigate the political and corporate world. When George Floyd was murdered and kind of the Black Lives Matter movement, picked up, lots of Black employees said, this isn't new. We've had these conversations. We've thought about how to navigate. And so part of what allyship is recognizing that my experience is different than others, and I may have privilege in certain areas, which we all do, right? If we're able-bodied, we have privileges, as compared to those who may have some type of physical disability or handicap. And how are we creating a more equitable situation and scenario for them? And so it's all about what are those things that we can pull in for one another to help level that playing field, because back to the scarf model, and again, lots of my conversations come back there, this idea of fairness, right? That we care very deeply about fair processes and we care very deeply about fair outcomes. And if we recognize that one group of people is not having a fair experience, that feels unjust to us on the whole. And we want to think about and really act on what can we do differently. And that's why allyship is so important, is that this is coming home in a lot of organizations. And I would even argue, and I've spoken with many folks that say, on the whole, politicians are not as trusted as they have been in the past. A lot of people continue to be quite spiritual and yet don't go to some of the same religious functions that they might have gone to in the past. And so more and more people are looking to their businesses and their corporations to say, what should we do here? These are places with billions and billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of employees. And, they help to influence governments and contracts and all sorts of other things. And now people are saying, I want to work in a place where my values are also represented. And so what can we do to make a more equitable workplace and ultimately, hopefully, a more equitable civilization?
Lovely. So that on allyship, on fairness, on equity, and more importantly, creating a very equal playing ground is what probably employees are looking for globally, which is leading me to my next question, Khalil, which is around, we have been digitalizing ourselves so much, from something like paper to a paperless workplace, from a workplace to remote working, from digital to digitalization. So we are shifting in every way in terms of the context of a workplace. However, I think one thing that remains very constant and will probably remain even in the years to come will be the human-centric values or the human-centric approaches that we have with one another, whether it's working at the workplace or remote. And how do you think, we can very consciously create a human-centric workplace?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on. And I would even almost say I think there are some places that are either intentionally or not moving away from being as human-centric. And so there are places that are monitoring performance to way more of a degree than they ever have before. And then there are lots and lots of other places that are saying, actually, we do want to put the person at the center of what we're doing. And so again, very similar to what we were talking about before, I've seen lots of organizations that have said one of the only benefits to the pandemic. And we've recognized, obviously, people have lost their lives. We all wish that this wasn't happening. And yet some folks have tried to find like, well, what are some of the things that we want to maintain as we go back to kind of our normal, or how do we build a better normal even, is something that we've been discussing quite a bit, is this idea that we're welcoming people into our homes in ways that we never have before, right? We are telling people about our families and our friends and our fears and our hopes and our experiences. Way more leaders are thinking about how do they become empathetic. And so I think your point is absolutely spot on, which is in a lot of ways, technology is making it somewhat easier for us to connect with other people. And as long as we remember that that is the intent behind these things, then, and this goes to what we were describing, which is how do we pause and get really clear on what it is that we're trying to accomplish? Because again, even as some folks have started to work remotely or work from home more often, you have some of those organizations that have said, well, now we need to track people's keystrokes. We need to see when they're at their computers. We need to track how much time they're working, because, you know, I operate from a place of scarcity, and I believe that people will, kind of take advantage of the situation and not work as hard. And then you have other organizations that have said, I recognize that some people are taking care of elderly parents. Some people are taking care of children. Some people are living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 other, roommates, and they're trying to find a quiet space to take a call like the one that we have right now. And because I recognize all of those things about the people around me, I am more empathetic, and I am more deliberate, and I am more active in how I'm choosing to be inclusive. And so I think that we will see kind of that consistent divide, or that bifurcation, where you have some organizations that are saying, we're going to try and squeeze as much as we possibly can out of every employee, and that is our way forward, and that is the way that we choose to run our business. But largely, you will find that employees choose, when they have an option, to work in the places that are not about beanbag chairs and coffee machines and, poker or pool tables and things like that, but rather about places where they feel respected and valued and seen and heard, and that they really can bring their full selves to work. For whatever that is, right? Not our full selves, but like our full corporate selves, the ones that are allowed to speak up and contribute ideas and be heard. And so I think the digitization is helpful in terms of, like, you and I wouldn't have been able to have this type of conversation previously. And now we can, and now we can connect, and you'll be able to share that with other people who hopefully will share it with others. And so there's a lot of value in that if we're deliberate about how we approach it and what we choose to put out through those digital means.
Lovely. So I hear you say that digitization is wonderful because it helps connect people globally. It also is an approach to kind of really delve on being human-centric despite and in spite technology hitting or not hitting us, which is beautiful. So I'm sure all our listeners are going to be very, very eager to know what is one book they should read to understand the brain better, to perform better, to focus better. So what is that one book that you would recommend?
Oh gosh, I mean, there are so many good ones. So I will say Dr. Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, has been one of the most formative books I've probably ever read. I read it, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago. And at this point, I have given it to new leaders. I've given it to new parents. I have probably downloaded or bought, dozens and dozens of copies. And so I absolutely love it. Dr. David Rock's Quiet Leadership is another one that talks quite a bit about, our brains and how our brains operate, and how, SCARF and all of that. And so those would be the two if I were going to kind of boil them down, and I could going to a desert island and I could only take those 2 books, it would be those 2.
Beautiful, beautiful. So thank you for that, Khalil. So we've kind of touched upon decision making, we touched upon autonomy, we touched upon learning, we touched upon flexibility with a framework, we touched upon SCARF, and then we saw ages, and we said, metacognition. And now it leads me to the most beautiful question of the day, perhaps. What makes Khalil happy?
Well, first off, what an amazing summary. I mean, we touched on quite a bit. This was a pretty broad conversation. What makes me happy, honestly, it's always been family. I have an amazing wife who has been my partner since high school. I've got two incredible boys. My eldest is 21 and he's getting ready to be a senior at Duke University, which is not that far from where we are. And my youngest is 9 and precocious and energetic and bouncing off the walls. And so it is them. And quite honestly, the other piece is this. It's conversations with people about leadership, about our brains, about the way we operate. I just believe that, when we talk about kind of things becoming digital, I think in some ways our rate of advancement in technology has outstripped our rate of advancement in humanity. Mm-hmm. And I want us to start thinking more about how do we take care of one another? How do we really lean into using technology as a tool? Because just like any tool, it can be used to build or it can be used to destroy. And I think if we're intentional about what it is that we're trying to do and we know more about ourselves and we learn more about one another, and we learn to see each other for the people that we truly are and beyond our political ideologies or our religions or our differences, but rather those things that bind us together. That for me is exciting, it's energizing, it's where I love spending my time. And so when I can be with them, I'm with them. And honestly, we're having a lot of these same types of conversations because my eldest is an engineer, but also took a kind of a minor in psychology, I think probably just to appease me. But to have these conversations about who we are and where we're going and to think very deeply about how we show up and how we show up in the world, that is when I'm at my happiest.
That's so wonderful and awesome to hear. I see the same humble self that I saw at the event in New York, and continue to inspire us, Khalil, wherever you are. Rock on with the wonderful work that you're doing. And I'll stay in touch with you for learning much, much more. And I think this conversation is really important because at this point in time, the world is hitting the pause button, in unity. We're all united in hitting the pause button to really see where the world is headed. And I think neuroscience is going to play a beautiful role in all our lives. Whether we are cognizant about that or not, it is hitting us one way or the other. So I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
As did I. Thank you so much.
Thanks for simplifying many of those concepts. And let's stay in touch, Khalil. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Meena, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And I'll talk to you very soon.
Absolutely. Bye-bye, Khalil.
All right. Bye.
Bye.